Cronin Toyota and Cronin Nissan are honored to partner with Proudly We Served, as well as the continued support of our local active and retired military veterans across eastern Indiana.
I'm Al Bledsoe, Veterans of Foreign War, Post 1108.
I'm Ron Chappell, Chaplain for Vietnam Veterans Post 777. And our guest today is Dwayne.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
All right. Dwayne Hodgin. And
well, we're pleased to have Dwayne with us today, and he's certainly no
stranger
to the veteran community. He's been around us now for several years writing some books, and that's what we're going to talk about just a little bit today. And why don't you give us a little fill-in of what you've been doing and where you've been going and things like that?
All right. Well, as you know, when I was on the program previously, I had written 2 books honoring our veterans from Wayne County. The first one was called They Served During America's Darkest and Finest Hours, which was our World War II veterans. That was followed up by a book that was called Forgotten Warriors Against the Odds, which honored our Korean and Vietnam War veterans. Mm-hmm. So this new book is kind of the trilogy, so to speak, in finishing the books as far as honoring and interviewing our veterans from now 3 major conflicts, wars, which have happened during my lifetime.
Sure. You seem to have a passion for veterans, and what is it that drives you, Dwayne?
Very much so. My dad was in the Pacific during World War II, and I had always admired and respected the military. He told me his bits and pieces of story throughout the year, and it wasn't until his final year before he died that he shared the end of that story with me. One of the things I tell veterans when I talk with them that I never served in the military. I was in college during the Vietnam War, and I had signed a teaching contract. I was actually drafted, but I was deferred because of the fact that they had a shortage of teachers. So this is my way of trying to pay it forward to those who did serve and who are still serving our country.
Well, you certainly did a good job at that. I mean, you know, when I first met you, explaining the World War II book and certainly the Vietnam book and the Korean War, that's pretty dear to most of us in our generation. And now starting the new book, that's got to be exciting to see how many of those young guys are actually in our community and hear some of their stories. It's a different world out there today with Iraq and Afghanistan. Yeah. I'm reading a book right now on a guy that was a quadriplegic or whatever you call that. He lost all of his limbs, and he's actually a motivational speaker.
Oh yeah, yes. Yeah.
And I'm reading his book now. Just got started on it, and that's got to be gut-wrenching, if you will, to what you do, because you're going to run into that with some of these young guys, I think. So.
Yeah, this book is called Boots on the Sand, The Global War on Terror, The Memories of Those Who Served. The time frame is 1991 up to the present, so we're looking at 26 years of this war. So I have interviewed veterans who were on the involved in the air war, the ground assault on Iraq during Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm, and veterans all the way up as we got into the Second Gulf War with Iraq and Afghanistan, and the various roles that they have played.
I still even know the war was decided. I mean, our country decided was going to do that. In my own mind, I still have a little bit of problem reckoning with all of that in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we put all that money into it. We put I think we lost, what, 6,000 and some
6,000,
guys.
yeah.
And, you know, that, to me, that has to stack up. Where Nam was just one of those things where people were drafted, and it was one of those things you got to go or else. But
For some of them.
well, yeah. Iraq, you know, a guy told me one time, and he was actually involved in the capture of Saddam Hussein. His unit is the one that captured him. And he told me one time the big difference between, if you will, me and thee, is we're a volunteer force. You guys were a drafted force.
Right.
So we went because we wanted to serve our country. We wanted to do something where he said you guys were probably, some, in most cases, maybe forced into it. So, except you.
Except for me.
Yeah.
I wanted to go. Young and dumb.
Yeah. So when will you finish up the book, Dwayne, do you think?
Well, the interviews will be finished hopefully this week. I had initially wanted to get 25 veterans across that 25-year spectrum representing different roles in the military and all branches of the military. And I have 50. So double more than what I thought. Because when I did this book, I didn't have any contacts. I didn't know really anybody that had served in Desert Storm and 203 on to the present when we were involved with Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11, as I did in World War II and Korea and Vietnam, and had some contacts. So this has really evolved. I am so pleased with the stories they've shared. What has amazed me is these men and women, they wanted their story to be told.
Wow.
Many of them feel forgotten, like Vietnam, because it's lasted so long. And I've had them just, you know, so gracious saying, thank you for telling our story. I want my 8-year-old daughter, when she's old enough to understand it, to be able to see my story in writing. And then if I want to add something to that, I can, but it's already there.
It sounds like you got a pretty broad spectrum of people included in the book. Were there those, though, I'm sure there may have been some, who didn't want to share the story? Did they, and if so, did they say why? Or?
You know, that's always an interesting question. By the time I am finished with this book in the last 7 years, I will have interviewed personally over 200 veterans across the state and even across the country. This book, I've interviewed veterans in different states, not just in Wayne County.
Oh, okay.
So I've got a lot of different stories in that way. But I would say that in all those 200 interviews, there are less than 10 that I contacted that just chose not to talk about their story. Which to me, is amazing.
A lot of the younger people, we see that, I see that a lot every day. A lot of the younger people don't really want that recognition. You know, sometimes, to me, I think I can almost find a veteran. I mean, I can almost tell a guy's a veteran after I talk to him for a little bit. But they're not as outgoing. Our generation is the one that's kind of propelling and pushing and trying to get things done, and working in the different clubs and trying to get things done. But the younger generation, it's very difficult to get them to come into the VFW or come into the American Legion or AMVETS or any of the veterans organization. Marine Corps League, they're pretty active. So, but it's difficult to get young ones committed where they'll come in and actually sit down and talk.
But you know, there are some, because they had such hideous engagement in a lot of cases, they don't want to talk about that. I've had the experience of talking with some vets in private consultation, you know, that, and one was dying, and the doctor said there's no reason why this person should still be living, and he wouldn't die until I had a chance to talk to him. And all he said was, Vietnam, I did some things I wish I hadn't done. And he passed, you know. So I'm just saying that may be the reason why some don't want to tell that story.
Well, I think we've got another thing, Al and Ron, it's generational. thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I
much.
interviewed World War II veterans, there were guys thinking back 60 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
They've had time to process this, just like you guys that were in Vietnam. You were thinking back 40 years ago. These guys maybe have only been out 10, 20 years or so, and so it's, you know, they're generationally just beginning to tell their stories, and I think that's why this is important, and I think they feel valued being asked. You know, while they're the age, like they said, that they can remember. And just like in all wars, they're terrible, and the stories, some are just unbelievable. But I think the biggest thing in this war that I learned that's different than the other wars is the multiple deployments and the demands that made on families, on the soldiers and airmen and Marines and seamen that were over there. That's just hard to believe. Whereas in Vietnam, you may have gone for a year unless you re-enlisted. World War II, if you went over, you might have been there 3 or 4 years. But when you came home, you were done. And these young people, especially in the military today, are facing that. It's a whole different kind of stress, a different type of war they're dealing with the improvised explosive devices and the carnage that is, has come from that. And through our medical science, many lives are being saved as they wouldn't have been in Vietnam and World War II. But many of them, their minds and their bodies are so shattered.
You know, that's a very good point. I hadn't thought about that, the multiple deployments. And you're right, when we went to Vietnam, at least for me, when I came back, I was done. I went to Laos 5 years later, but it was 5 years. I went and did 13 months there and came back. But these guys, they come back, they'd stay home about 6 months maybe, or whatever, and they're back gone again. And
My brother was, he spent 34 years in the Army and retired as a command sergeant major. He was a ranger with the 82nd Airborne. First deployment was the first when Bush 1 sent guys there in 90 or 91. Only recently, and I'm saying a year, would he talk about anything, and now he don't talk about much. He just almost clams up, and he said, all you gotta do is look at me and know that it didn't work out for me. So, I mean, it's just,
oh, excuse me.
He's my brother, so, I mean, I really, and even if you reach out to him, he is very reluctant to even, like, talk to family. I mean, he's just that way, but.
One of the things I often wondered after doing all these interviews, and I finally asked a couple of veterans in the Gulf Wars here that I've interviewed, I said, help me understand why you don't know me, I'm not a veteran, why you would even talk to me. And the response in general was, well, first of all, because you weren't a veteran, you don't pass any judgment on us because you didn't experience it. And like I've always said, if you haven't been to war, if you haven't been in combat, if you haven't been in some support role that's helping those who are, you really don't understand it. So you're more open to listen. And the other thing I always tell them is it's your story. I ask no probing questions. And then they know that after I type their story, it goes back to them for final edit. But it has really amazed me of how open these men and women have been in all these books that I interviewed them involved in 4 wars.
I find that once you get a conversation started with them and put it kind of, if you will, where they're at, they do open up a lot. I mean, I find that to be true. Every veteran that comes into the dealership out there signs in the book. If they have a phone number, I call them and thank them for their service. And we have, on average, maybe 10 or 15 a month that sign that book. So we cater more to the veteran community, and I think, and just looking back at it, or maybe even, and looking at where we're at with things in this world today, Are we really losing track of our veterans? Trump has brought it forward a little bit and put that in the limelight with the VA and all that stuff. But until that happened, we were just not getting promoted, if you will, the way we should.
Yeah, Dwayne, though, hit on something that kind of triggered a thought in my mind. When we talk about the willingness to open up and talk to you because you're not a veteran, you know, this might be something we might want to consider in counseling veterans. We always assume that because they're veterans, if you put a veteran in that position, that they'll be more open to talk. But the judgmental issue, and now I've not had that problem, but some might say, well, you know, you were only this or you were only that, or you know, that kind of thing. At least they may perceive that and not be willing to share. So that's a good point.
The other thing I could think, you know, people have asked me, well, you've done all these interviews, you've spanned this, you know, almost 80-some years or more of war, is the, you know, what are the commonalities? Well, everybody will tell you, you know, war is terrible, war is hell, nobody wants it, but, you know, there's such this spirit, and I don't care whether it's the Marines or the Army or the Air Force, whatever it might be, that this strong sense of duty and purpose and patriotism is just, you know, it just humbles me to see how humble they are. Nobody ever talks about from the concept, this is me, this is what I did, I received these commendations, I received these medals. It was about humility, service, patriotism, even though politically, you know, maybe they didn't agree with some things, there was no question with, you know, they did what they were trained to do, and they did it to the best of their abilities.
The active duty part, I think that's what the younger ones, especially when they're in some kind of a guard unit, or if they're going to get activated, I mean, I think they all live in the fear of that number is going to get called one of these days, and then they're gone for however long.
I mean, we all did. You know, when I went in, I didn't go in to go to war.
Yeah, right.
Well, I was gung ho though. I mean, I thought that was the American way. You know, that you have to do that. My dream when I was 17 years old was I wanted to wear a military uniform, and then it became reality. And so, I mean, I never get over that. I'm still very sensitive to veterans issues, and some of them I just wished I could take a magic wand and sweep across it and help every one of them that needs help, because you run into guys all the time that they've got some issues. There's some pretty deep issues out there. The government, and that's a different story, but the government has really not done a good job of taking care of that.
I totally agree with that.
And
this is, you know, some of the feeling, not a sense of bitterness from these veterans, but kind of a sense of, like I say, being abandoned, you know, by their government to provide the type of services and treatment, you know, that they need when they come home. This generation of young people that go in the military are so highly skilled and trained. It's unbelievable what they can do. 17, 18, 19-year-old kids still. And the things that they're doing as far as technology skills and you know, all the organizational planning skills are just unbelievable. And I guess one of my biggest concerns is here we take these young people, we provide them this unbelievable training, which costs hundreds of thousands of dollars per soldier. They serve and they come home and there's no jobs. I mean, if I were an employee, I'd be reaching out trying to find every one of these men or women I could.
I tell you, we had the guy on that handled the workforce development, thanks for Indiana, and the veteran community. It's been said that veterans are some of the best people to hire.
No
Usually
question.
they're going to show up on time, and they don't have they don't have drug issues. They're pretty disciplined type people. We have 6 veterans, I think, at the dealership. And you can tell because they're always there. You know what I mean? They're just
sharp.
That's just built into them. So,
but the training that you get, you know, in the military, I remember, you know, the schools that I attended, when I did eventually retire, I had several options because of the breadth of the training. I didn't just know that particular job. I knew the jobs that impacted on that job as well. You know, so it made me more valuable. And similarly with these young folks, you know, they don't know just how to operate the computer. They know the system.
Absolutely.
You know, it makes them more valuable to an employer. Yeah.
I met a young man. He's actually a first lieutenant, just got promoted, and he's going to be an F-104 pilot.
Okay.
So he's been in 3 years. That's constantly, and I think he has another year left, or another 2 years, and then he'll be doing solo, if you will. But if that young man decided, well, I'm fed up with this stuff, I want to get out of here, so he can go to just about any civilian company with the training that he's got as a pilot.
Yeah.
He can do. He's 22. He'll be maybe 24 years old, and he was generally excited about all that stuff. It was. I told him it's just good to see a young kid that's excited about being in the military and excited about what he was doing. And what you do brings that out in so many people. I think
this is good.
The conversations that you have, I
this
think,
is good.
brings out that personality a little bit in that young one or whatever.
Yeah.
So,
A couple other things, if I could share, if we have time.
We don't want to miss it.
yeah.
Okay, is that two things. One, and again, this goes back to World War II veterans told me this, Korea, Vietnam, all of it, but is the humanitarian efforts that our military does in times of combat.
Oh, yeah.
I'm talking not only, you know, during the times when combat or conflict isn't going on, but, and you know, this story isn't told back home.
Right.
You know,
Right.
what they do. Let me give you one example. A Marine captain who I interviewed, reconnaissance platoon, they were on the spearhead of going into Baghdad and talked about the tough issues that they were facing. But they came to this village, and this village had just been decimated, you know, by war, but especially, you know, by the enemy. And they had to advance forward. He'd gotten orders to advance forward, and their combat medic, you know, who they called doc, said, no, these people need help. And he said, I had to make that decision for the safety of my own men, whether or not we stopped and helped.
Those people, yeah.
And he said he convinced me, and we stopped and helped those civilians,
Yeah.
Wow.
you know,
Yeah.
and went on.
Yeah.
And the other
That's
thing
a neat
is,
story.
Yeah,
is that I learned things that I didn't know about, and then we wonder why our soldiers, you know, and military personnel experience this type of trauma. And people deal with it in different ways, and they have in all wars, we know that. But a young man who was 19 years old, he was so gung-ho for the Army, you know, when he joined, he went through all of his training. I'm sorry, he was a Marine. And his first assignment, they told him he was going to do in charge of a patrol where they go and bring back the vehicles that have been damaged to try to repair them. But they said also that you're going to be involved with sanitization. He had no idea what that was. Basically what that was going and taking the bodies out of our vehicles and body parts,
Yeah.
and then going back and having to clean them.
That's right.
And, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
and he did this for a year.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
you know, and like I say, nobody comes back from war the same person they were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so stories like that, and the IEDs, and the constant deployments, and the, you know, the firefights, which may only last 10 minutes, but seem like they lasted 10
Forever.
hours
Yeah.
because they were so intensive.
Wow.
Yeah.
And see, that's for a 19 or a 20-year-old or 21 whatever the age is, that would be almost devastating. And yet, and I'm going to have to say that, our government has not been there when they needed to be there for the young ones, the old ones, all of us. That's just, to me, that's just unthinkable that we just don't have that help. That's.
So your book,
don't get that.
Dwayne, would this be
Yeah.
a book that could be used by counselors and.
Oh.
I would think, you know.
I think in sharing, yes, sharing some of the stories. The other thing, as the other books, it's a history book.
Right.
Because they're telling history through their personal experiences during that 25-year period.
Why don't you, we're going to have to shut it down.
How do you get the book?
Yeah,
How
that's
do they get the book?
that's what
Folks
it's
out
coming
there?
to.
All right,
Yeah,
we'll have a reception and a celebration at the Veterans Memorial Park in June. Present the books to the veterans, families.
We get one?
And then there'll be a book signing, and all proceeds from this book are going to go to the Richmond High School Alumni Association, whereas the other two went to the Historical Museum.
All right.
So,
Well, that's it's been good to have you with us today.
As always, yeah.
And it's
yeah.
always interesting to see your take on things. I mean,
Yeah.
I really enjoy that a lot. So, with that, we're going to have to sign
We
off.
gotta go.
So,
Hey, proudly we serve, folks. We'll have to see you next time.
see you next time.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cronin Toyota and Cronin Nissan are honored to partner with Proudly We Served, as well as the continued support of our local active and retired military veterans across eastern Indiana.